And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome on in to the third anniversary Fantasy Football Podcast. Brett Malamuth here with you, along with Zach Malamuth. Zach, how are you?
I'm doing all right. You could see I have a new setting here, Brett. I graduated college this past weekend. It's crazy to say that, but I mean, you got a nice stretch here. I'll be home for this.
Yeah, it's an exciting time right now in the NFL. We obviously have OTAs that happened over the last week that are going to continue through the weekend, and rookie mini camps as well happened a few weeks ago, and then on top of that, we have a schedule release that came out just a little over a week ago, and we actually have some games to look forward to, and a lot of primetime games that were featured in this schedule. Zach, did anything stand out to you as far as the actual games? Does any game actually stick out to you?
Not really. I mean, there's like a couple that you would see and say, wow, all right, that's gonna be cool. No crazy games. I think what stood out a little bit more was like the bye weeks. I think that was a big thing that I think you sent me a nice list of them. Just how many go on, I think, later in the season and later in the fantasy season. I think that kind of gives some teams an advantage because you look at a lot of those teams and you say, all right, well, the later section of bye weeks, I would say you would probably prefer that because, I mean, the better guys in fantasy football, a lot of them are on the better football teams and they would be looking towards the playoffs. So it kind of gives them that first stretch and then next stretch heading into the fantasy playoffs. I think that's even bigger for them to get that bye week. It kind of rejuvenates the guys and helps them out as they look towards the playoffs. But for fantasy playoffs, I think having there was a fair amount of teams that had later bye weeks. I think there was 6 in 14. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I think that kind of stands out of like, okay, there's that good stretch of teams and they could be ready for the fantasy playoffs. That's what we're looking forward to this upcoming season.
Yeah, I think the only takeaways I had from were the Jets got a lot of primetime games. We know that Aaron Rodgers' primetime is a different kind of Aaron Rodgers than he is normally. And so, stock up a little bit on that. And then I would say the other thing is, there's a couple of those like weeks 15, 16, 17 that are going to be the fantasy playoff implications. Some teams like, Houston, for example, they play against Miami, the Chiefs, and Baltimore. Probably a little bit of a rougher stretch there for the fantasy playoffs. Whereas you have some of those teams that are going to have a little bit of a lighter load, like the Chargers, for example, who play against the Buccaneers, Denver, and New England. Little light things there. I think that's sort of going to develop itself because obviously we don't really know how some of these teams are going to do from the start of the season. There's some teams that could come out unexpected and just be really, really good. And therefore, we can't really say, okay, well, we have to go take all of the Chargers and we can't take any of the Houston Texans. Baltimore could come out flat. We don't really know until the season rolls around what we're actually looking at. So a conversation for another day, but I think that, when the schedule does come out, you sort of start to peek at, hey, where are those primetime games and, who are the guys that are effective in primetime versus, those 1:00 starts. And then, kind of take a look down and see down the road what might be coming in because obviously, your goal is to get into the playoffs, but at the same time, weeks 15, 16, 17, you're obviously looking for the best matchups. And you find in redraft, at least, that your bench doesn't exactly matter because you're not scoring any. So you kind of see some of those like defensive matchups. Like I remember in our league, there were teams in our league that were just dropping bench guys because they weren't going to need them and picking up 4 defenses to make sure that each week they had the top matchup heading into the playoffs for the long run.
Yeah, definitely agree with you, and something to look forward to really on a later day, like you said. But obviously taking a peek at it, it's quite interesting where a lot of these guys will end up and how it'll impact their fantasy season.
So over the last couple of weeks, we obviously previewed and then recapped the draft as far as the Dynasty content goes. So go check those out. Subscribe to us on YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Give us the thumbs up. Over the next couple of weeks here, we're going to start into our division previews. This is something that we've now done 2 years in a row here. And Zach, I think that this year we're sort of going to split it up to one division per episode. Kind of give a little bit of a deeper dive into each team and what fantasy impact might be. And so, again, subscribe to us on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be able to follow along with us as we go through each division and kind of give the highs and the lows of some of the teams, go position by position. Today, we're going to start out actually with the NFC East, and then next week we will continue with the AFC East. But Zach, let's just briefly dive into the Dallas Cowboys. And it's kind of an interesting offseason for them. Obviously, not a huge amount of change that happened. Obviously, they lose Tony Pollard, but they bring back Elliott in that running back room. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. Obviously, there's some contract disputes that might be going on with CeeDee Lamb, with Dak Prescott, who's upcoming. How do you look for these guys from the redraft and the dynasty standpoint?
So it's quite interesting, Brad. We have kind of a weird stretch for the Dallas Cowboys because we don't see this too often, and you often hear the names and who's here and, oh, they're going to go far. This is the year that I'm saying, oh boy, it might be a rough stretch here for the Dallas Cowboys because they got to figure out all those contracts. CeeDee Lamb, of course, they have Micah Parsons on the other side that they're going to have to figure that out as well. I think obviously getting rid of Pollard, they then look back now at Ezekiel Elliott, who they bring in, also Rico Dowdle, who they have there, who had a really solid season for his standards last year. And I think he could take another step up this year with the absence of Tony Pollard now. I think when you look at it, these teams, I mean, Dak Prescott is going to be probably in the top 10 in terms of fantasy quarterbacks. We've seen some yes seasons and some no seasons from Dak. Obviously, last season, I think, stands out, though, with how well he played in terms of fantasy. And I think, again, he's going to be in that top 10. Some people may even say top 5. I wouldn't really argue with that too much, except for the fact that he now is down on a couple of weapons from last year. And now, obviously, he has that running game, and he'll rely on some different running backs than he did a year ago. So I think that stands out. And, of course, CeeDee Lamb's going to be in the top 5. Some people may say in the top 3 of wide receivers this year. I would completely agree with you because there's just not much else, I would say, in terms of top caliber weapons for Dak. I think CD will be up there again. The interesting one, I think, is in terms of the running game, Brett. And I think I said it a couple weeks ago. Zeke's going to be in there for the goal line and maybe a couple early downs, but I think Rico Dowdle is going to get a huge chunk of those fantasy points. I think that's what stands out here because of the Cowboys, not really a running offense. They really pass the ball, and they're going to rely on Dak to have the ball in his hands. Rico Dowdle is going to be the running back out of the backfield. And I think he did a really good job next to Dak when he was in the receiving game last year. So I would say Rico Dowdle would probably be like running back 23. And then I would put Zeke at like running back 30 because I think he's going to get the goal line touches. I think that's probably the stretch I would put there. But other than that, I don't see any of those wide receivers really stepping up. Yeah, Brandon Cooks. I'm not putting him as a fantasy starter. I think it's really CD, Dak, and then, like I said, you can figure it out with Dowdle. The tight ends, you can kind of go any which way. Of course, Ferguson had the year last year, but it could be any of these guys.
Yeah, so for me, it kind of goes two ways here because we have Dak Prescott right now, who I think is a very underrated player, probably in that quarterback 5 to 8 range as far as it goes in the redraft sphere, and so you're probably thinking about round 6, 7, 8, kind of when that wave of quarterbacks starts to go. I think that's sort of where you're going to see him go, and obviously it sort of depends on what your league is, which is why I spread it out for 3 rounds. But you will obviously have that wave of quarterbacks that everybody tries to get one, and so you'll see 3 or 4 quarterbacks go in a row, or in a certain round at least. And so I think Dak is part of that little ride there. As far as the dynasty standpoint, listen, he's 30 years old. He's going to be 31, coming to a contract year. And Jerry Jones has been talking a lot about how he's the quarterback of the future, and we still haven't seen a contract put in place. Obviously, now we see quarterbacks like Jared Goff that are getting paid, and that's just going to keep making the bill higher for Jerry. So honestly, I think that he's trying to figure out a way to get CeeDee Lamb paid first, from the younger standpoint, and then he'll figure out Dak on the second part. I think that both of these deals do get done, and that they both will be Cowboys for the long term. But you understand the concern as a fantasy owner, trying to go out and sell Dak or buy Dak. You might be a little hesitant. I'm one who was in the company of, like, go out and buy Dak. If you think that the owner of Dak Prescott in your dynasty league is a little low on him and is uncertain, I think that this is a good opportunity to buy low on Dak Prescott. As far as it goes in the running back room, I think it's a little bit of an unknown. And we've seen Ezekiel Elliott be a shell of himself when he was in New England. I don't know that he's be this all-out force. And so, yeah, he's probably a later pick, probably around running back, 35 even. Probably falls below some of those second options as far as it goes. And I just really think that it has to do with the fact that they're going to utilize Rico Dowdle a little bit more, utilize Deuce Vaughn a little bit more, and it's going to be almost a committee approach to the running back room. Just don't know that Zeke is going to be this workhorse back. As far as it goes with the wides, though, I think that this is a very interesting offseason just from the standpoint of, listen, we talk about the big 3 as far as the receivers go in the dynasty standpoint. You have CeeDee Lamb, you have Justin Jefferson, you have Jamar Chase. Cincinnati's coming off a year where Joe Burrow couldn't stay healthy. Does that linger a little bit? And now with the Higgins sort of offseason, and we don't really know if he's going to be on the team next year, and the long-term status of him, that lead to Jamar Chase getting doubled a little bit more, or even tripled if he needs to be, especially if T. Higgins isn't there. I don't know, but I think that it's a little more unknown there. I think it's a little unknown as far as Justin Jefferson's standpoint goes, because he's got a rookie quarterback coming in, who you and I were a little unsure of coming in. And so I think it was a good offseason for CeeDee Lamb, and I think that there's a lot of people right now, especially in the dynasty community, who are ranking him as wide receiver 1. Listen, I can't shy away from that. I think that it's really close. I still personally give the edge to Justin Jefferson, but it's really close. I think that I would say that CeeDee Lamb is number 2 if he's not number 1. That's how I would rank them, but I can understand the people who are saying, okay, well, CeeDee Lamb's number 1 because Kirk Cousins isn't there anymore. I get it. As far as the redraft standpoint goes, he is the number 1 guy for me. I think that it goes him and then it goes Tyreek Hill, actually. I think that Justin Jefferson slides his way down in the rankings. Probably, I might even pick Amon-Ra over him because it's a sure thing. Amon-Ra is going to get the ball. Listen, they're all first rounders. I just think that this is going to be one of those years where, unlike last year, where it was sort of like get your running back pretty early because they're just, the well is sort of dry. I kind of see this year being dominated in the first round redraft standpoint by the wide receivers. And so I think that at the very top end of it, you're going to see Christian McCaffrey go first. CeeDee Lamb in the majority of leagues is going to be the second pick.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's definitely fair. We'll finish this off, Brett, with the question right now the question that keeps on giving right now. Early season, obviously in the off season, are the Dallas Cowboys still like a playoff team with their roster? Are they still in there? Are they gonna make it far? They're built just very strangely right now because they had to give up so many guys because they're looking to obviously give those contracts to those big names. And it's kind of hurt them in terms of they're not on the same level as some of those other teams in the NFC. I mean, there's 5, 6 teams that you'd easily give the advantage over the Cowboys, and maybe they stick at 7. Obviously, there's 7 teams that make it into the playoffs in each conference. Would you put the Cowboys like in there right now? Do you think they're in there?
I do. I think that the Cowboys are there. And honestly, I think that, I just talked about it at the top of the show, that schedule. I think that when you look at weeks 12 to, 16, even 17, really, but 12 to 16, they have a stretch where they play the Commanders, the Giants, the Bengals, the Panthers, the Bucks, and then the Eagles are week 17. So I think there's a nice stretch in there where they can rack up some games, come into that Philadelphia game red hot, and now you're talking about playing New Year's, a couple days before New Year's Eve, heading into week 17. They round out the schedule with the Commanders, in week 18. Doesn't affect from a fantasy standpoint, but I think there's a nice stretch in there, which is why I think that a lot of people are going to look at that, especially based on how those opponents fared last year, and pick a lot of Cowboys. And so I think they're a playoff team. I think they'll be there. I think that, again, I think these two guys are going to get paid and be Cowboys for, the long haul. I don't see that changing. I don't think that Jerry Jones wants to start over at a quarterback. I think he's pretty much established himself with Dak Prescott. He's made that pretty known to the media as well. But yeah, I think there's a nice little stretch in there where they can rack up some wins, have them in week 17, maybe knock off, the Eagles in Philadelphia, in what will probably be a national stage game. Right now it's a 425 game. But obviously if Fox lets them flex it to a night game, I think that that's one of those games that could end up being, a Sunday Night Football late season flex with the division on the line.
Yeah, definitely fair. I mean, you look at the NFC right now, and obviously we'll get to this closer in the season, but there's you look at each division and you say, yeah, there's pretty much 2 teams in each division that you would say, all right, they got a real shot to make it to the playoffs. Every single division has that. I mean, you look at all those teams, and one team is going to be unhappy in the end. The NFC is kind of a gauntlet this year. I kind of like it, Brett.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, just sort of how that division is going, because it looked like every team sort of improved. And so, it's going to be a little bit close. Obviously, you look at teams like the Giants, who obviously lose Saquon Barkley. We'll get to them in just a second. For the most part, their defense improved. And so I think that they'll still be a better team than they were last year, maybe not from the running game standpoint or the fantasy football standpoint. But just quickly, I didn't touch on Jake Ferguson. I think that he's probably a back end tight end 1, just like he was last year. Probably, tight end. I'm just spitballing. Probably like 8 to 10, tight end 8 to 10, right in that back end of your tight end 1 range.
Definitely fair.
All right, so we jump right to the next team here. It is the New York Giants. Zach, a big offseason for them, and obviously we headed into the draft, and we weren't really sure if they were going to go with Daniel Jones, J.J. McCarthy. We heard a lot of rumors about Drake May going. Obviously, doesn't fall their way. They do pass on J.J. McCarthy. They go Malik Neighbors instead. How do you see these guys shaking up, especially with the unknown of Darren Waller and what his future might be like?
So, I mean, I'm looking at Neighbors, and he's clearly the number 1 in this group, but I think it's going to take a tiny bit of time to obviously sink in with Daniel Jones, sink in with this offense. I think, but looking at Neighbors, the big thing about him is I said he can run short route, and then once he gets the ball in his hands, he is gone. You're not catching him. He's in the dust. So I think looking at Neighbors, I think he's going to have a real solid year because I just don't think there's too much else around him. I would probably, I don't know exactly where I put him, just probably outside the top 20. I think I'm really that high on him because I think just looking at the Giants plus the fact that they may not have Darren Waller, there's just nobody else then. Yeah, you're looking at Wan'Dale Robinson and Jalen Hyatt, but you would take a guy like Malik Neighbors in that spot. So maybe not just outside the top 20, probably in that 20 to 30 range, wherever you want to put him, maybe 25 to 30. I think he's there because I think he's the wide receiver one in this room and can have a really solid impact early because, I mean, he also is coming from an offense in LSU, like a high-powered SEC offense. I mean, you're playing against the top prospects that were in the draft this year. So that's a big advantage on his part. I think Neighbors, I would probably put him 25 to 30 range, wherever you want to put him. But I think he's there because of the situation right now in New York. I would say Daniel Jones, probably on the lower end of quarterbacks. Yes, he can change that with his running ability, but I haven't seen him in a year. So I don't really completely know. He obviously is coming off of that ACL injury, which is kind of big for running quarterbacks. You just don't know now. Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be different? You kind of got to figure it out. In terms of Devin Singletary, this is a guy I'm going to keep an eye on, Brett, in terms of redraft. I think when you look at this offense and I talk about, oh, well, they don't have a lot of weapons. I think they are going to rely on Devin Singletary like there's no tomorrow, Brett. I really like this move when they lost Saquon Barkley because I think Devin Singletary is a guy who can just come in and put in good work. And the fantasy rankings are not treating him well. A lot of people have him, they're lower on their boards in the 30s. And I think he's going to be pushed up boards pretty quickly because I think there's just not enough around him in that running game as well. I mean, they got some names there, younger guys, and Eric Gray and Gary Brightwell. Like it's Devin Singletary's backfield, and they may say, "Oh, well, Daniel Jones can run the ball." Daniel Jones, like I said, coming off a torn ACL. So, questioning that, I think this offense is going to be circled around if Waller does not play. Because if Waller plays, I think he's going to get his targets, and you kind of know what you're going to get from him as long as he stays healthy. If Waller's out, this offense is Singletary and Neighbors and just run with it.
Yeah, it's fair. Listen, as far as the running back room goes, I agree with you. I think that Devin Singletary is being really underrated right now. We saw what he was able to do when he was the running back one in Buffalo, and obviously he had a ton of value then from the fantasy standpoint, both dynasty and redraft. He unseated Pierce last year. I think that sort of goes unnoticed. That he was able to become the running back one in that sort of high flying offense in Houston, and I think that people keep forgetting about that and writing him off because he's replacing Saquon Barkley. Obviously, you talk New York, and so there's a lot of microscopes, and they lost this big name, and so how are you going to replace him? It reminds me of when to completely go off the rails here and go off to a different sport. It reminds me of when Derek Jeter left and Didi Gregorius sort of got this, shame toward him. And listen, it worked out that first year. He was very good and he was able to play, a suitable style that the Yankees liked. And so, yeah, I just think that they're sort of writing Devin Singletary off already because they're mad about the fact that Saquon's not there. So yeah, I think he's a back end running back too to start. And obviously sky's the limit. He was really good down the stretch. I also am keeping my eye on Tyrone Tracy Jr. I think that that's a really good handcuff to have this year in case it doesn't work out with Singletary. Right now, Tracy only has to unseat Eric Gray to become the running back two. Eric Gray was a very big disappointment last year as being running back two in the Giants to the point where they went out and they got another running back in the draft. So that's a guy that I'm at least keeping my eye on. Talk Daniel Jones, he's been up and down. When we go back a couple of years ago to 2022, Daniel Jones had a bunch of top 10 finishes as a quarterback. And I think that shouldn't really go unnoticed. I think that, last year, obviously, he got hurt. But to start the year, he had week 2, he finished as quarterback 1 in fantasy. And yeah, I just think that it's sort of the New York microscope that he's under, where they're sort of writing him off. And yeah, he's probably not going to finish as this top 10, even top 15 quarterback. But I think that, when you're sort of in a bind and you need that low end super flex guy to just get you some points, he'll get you some points. I think that, obviously they went out and they drafted Malik Neighbors. I think that sort of changes a little bit as far as what they're going to do. I think that Neighbors is probably a round 4, round 5 pick, depending on how your draft goes, and he'll be in that tier of wide receiver where he's still going to dictate what they're doing from the passing game. I also think it sort of frees up Wan'Dale Robinson a little bit. Guy's only 23 years old. I think that a lot of people have already wrote him off. I think he's a super buy low candidate in Dynasty, especially because they're sort of looking at Jalen Hyatt as the guy, the Dynasty community, because he was a hot rookie coming in last year. Listen, Wan'Dale Robinson got a lot of praise from Dable and Co. Just a year ago before he got his injury-ridden season. I think that they sort of get back to that. They use him a lot in the shorter game, and they sort of let Neighbors be the 1, but Wan'Dale ends up being the 2, not Jalen Hyatt. Hyatt and Slayton I sort of see in the same sort of tier, where they'll kind of get their deep balls, they'll get their balls over the middle, downfield. But I really think that it's going to be Wan'Dale Robinson and Malik Neighbors heading forward. Then there's the tight end room, and this is the most interesting one. It really just depends on what the situation is with Darren Waller. I think that if Waller does in fact retire, then Theo Johnson actually is a very, sleeper target I would pick at the very end of my draft. Sort of like what we had a couple of years ago, Zach, if you remember back to Irv Smith Jr., and you and I picked him in almost every draft that we were in this last couple of rounds. I think that that's sort of the role I see for Theo Johnson, a guy who was able to quickly get out for Penn State and catch the ball and make a quick move, knock a guy over. I think that that's, a potential big fit just based on the fact of we watched how often Darren Waller got the ball when he was playing with Daniel Jones, that he quickly looked for his tight end. There is potential that sort of happens if Darren Waller's not there and Daniel Jones, all of a sudden the rush comes in, the offensive line breaks down. He needs to get rid of the ball. Theo Johnson's right there on the short yardage. I think that the quarterback struggles could end up leading to a guy like a Theo Johnson having a bit of a bigger role. So yeah, I'm taking a flyer on him at the end of most drafts if Waller decides to hang him up.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. And in Waller's case, it's just difficult to rank him right now because we just don't know what his future is. I'd see some of these rankings have him lower and in the mid-teens. That's a spot for him right now because you just don't know what's going to happen. Quite interested to see how that's going to shape out. Obviously, a lot of this Giants season and this Giants offense is reliant on what's going to happen with Darren Waller. So we'll wait and find out, and hopefully news will come soon about it, Brett.
All right, so jumping into our next team, and we alluded to them earlier, but it was a huge offseason for the Philadelphia Eagles. They obviously go out and they get Saquon Barkley on their team, and I think that that's going to sort of change what they're doing. They get rid of Swift as well, and so they actually went out and they go draft Will Shipley, who I think is a pretty late round dynasty target right now in rookie drafts. Obviously, Jalen Hurts stays there. They bring Kenny Pickett in on a trade to be his backup. And then it's sort of the same deal as far as it goes in the receiver core. The addition of Johnny Wilson late in the draft, Amos Smith in the end of the draft, and then obviously they bring in CJ Uzama to back up Dallas Goedert. But for the most part, I think that we're looking at these guys sort of the same that we looked at last year. I think Jalen Hurts is probably quarterback 1 or 2 to kind of splitting hairs a little bit as far as it goes with Hurts and Mahomes and Josh Allen. And now CJ Stroud seems to be in this conversation as well. I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on how that quarterback room shakes out? As far as the rankings go compared to the other guys.
It's difficult because I do think some people like doubt Lamar a little bit, and Lamar has proven time and time again that, I mean, he is that dude. He is really, really strong when it comes to fantasy. And I think he should be a little bit closer or higher to the top than he is. He's at 4 right now. A lot of people put Mahomes at 3, which I can see it. Obviously, if we're talking about like the best quarterback in football, yeah, Mahomes is 1, then it's not even close. But in terms of fantasy, you would probably say, all right, Allen and Hurts, I'd take them over Mahomes because of what they're able to do on the ground, number one. I think the other thing is just everything that they do to help a fantasy quarterback's value. I would probably put Hurts at 2. A lot of people have him at 2. I think that's the spot for him because I do think Josh Allen is going to have to run for his absolute life this year. I think that's going to be a big thing for Allen to just do it all. That's what I'm looking at for Josh Allen this year. And even though they grabbed Keon Coleman in the draft, they lost a lot of guys on that offense. And yes, they still have James Cook, and they're going to have to figure things out. That ball is going to be in Josh Allen's hands and take us to the promised land more than ever than it has been in the last couple of years up in Buffalo. I would probably put Hurts at 2. I think that's the spot for him, right ahead of Mahomes and Lamar. I can kind of go either way on which one I'd rather put at 3. But the big thing is obviously the offseason acquisition. It's Saquon Barkley. And in this offense where they focus pretty heavily on the run, they do, even though they have all those weapons, they do focus pretty heavily on that run game and getting Jalen Hurts out into space and getting the running backs out in the space. I mean, we saw Swift have a real impact last year. Yeah, Saquon's a top 5 running back. He is, because he's in this offense. Some people may push him a little bit down boards because they say, oh, well, they got so many weapons. We can agree to disagree. He's Saquon Barkley. I think he's going to get his touches. He's going to do his thing. What I would say is some people, like what people are underestimating is that although Hurts gets his touches, I think he's going to be down on touches a little bit too because he's going to have to give some to Saquon. I think as long as Saquon's healthy, he should get that healthy amount of touches versus a guy like Swift last year where it wasn't the typical running back touches. He just had great production with all those, with the linemen and how they ran their offense. But Saquon's in the top 5. For the other ones, I would say Brown gets just outside that nice stretch of wide receivers. You said it, it's either CD or Tyreek at the top. And then you can kind of go either way on the next 4 with Chase in there, Jefferson's in there, Amon-Ra's in there, A.J. Brown's in there. I think they're all like pretty equal. Maybe you put Chase a little bit higher because of the Higgins situation. Maybe he'll get the ball a little bit more. But they're in that stretch right there, A.J. Brown is. I would say Devonta Smith probably in the same stretch that he's always been, just inside the top 20. I mean, that's really the stretch we've seen for the last 2-3 years now, Brett, of Devonta Smith, or 2 years because that's how long Brown's been there. But, I mean, it's probably pretty typical there in terms of that wide receiver room. And I would say for Goddard, it's all about health because he was not healthy. And there was a good stretch of that last year. I would say he could be just inside the top 10. I would put him there. Yes, you could say there's so many weapons, but Jalen Hurts always finds a way to get it to his tight ends. He always finds a way to get it to Dallas Goedert. So I think the production will still be there as long as Goddard's healthy. And this offense, I mean, they are ready to roll. You had a guy like Saquon. It takes your offense to a completely new level, and they're excited down in Philly.
Obviously, yeah, you talk about Jalen Hurts and where he kind of ranks, I think that, Dynasty, I think that redraft, it's sort of just like you said, it's those three and it's Lamar. I think are all sort of neck and neck with each other. You can make an argument for any one of those four to be the first quarterback off the board. I don't know if I can fault you because I think it's really, really close between the four if you did take one of them as the first quarterback off the board. I think that, a guy like a CJ Stroud's probably just a nick underneath them. I just think there's so much expectation going on this year about him. And obviously, we'll talk about him in just a few weeks when we hit their division. But yeah, as far as it goes with, that wide receiver tiers, I think that I sort of agree with you. Like there's that top, we talked a little bit ago when we talked CeeDee Lamb, like the big three. I think you can make an argument that Amon-Ra is probably in that tier as well, if he's not in the second tier. But A.J. Brown's probably in that second tier. From a dynasty standpoint, I would probably say you probably got to put, a Puka Nacua in there, Garrett Wilson in there, Marvin Harrison Jr. probably ends up in there, Tyreek Hill probably ends up in there, and then, A.J. Brown's probably in there as well. And then I would say that even just that tier below that, you talk like, Ayuk and Olave and London and on and on and on. Neighbors probably fits in there. That's probably where you fit a Devonta Smith. I think that's sort of that range where you'll see him. I think that I talked at the top about the strategy this year in redraft and how I think those wide receivers are sort of going to go at the very top draft, other than Christian McCaffrey. I think that we sort of saw that, sort of reversed from last year where it was that top running backs and the back end of your first round into the second round. Last year, it was receivers. I think this year it sort of is a reverse where those running backs are ending up at the back end of the first round into the second round. So Saquon is still a first round talent for me from a redraft standpoint. I think he is a top 5 running back. And so, he deserves to be a first round pick this year. A.J. Brown, you can argue, is very back end first round pick, whether he goes 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th in your league. But I would say that he also should at least be there in the conversation. Hurts is probably your first, if not second guy off the board, I think. But again, you can make the argument for any of those 4 guys. So, again, it sort of depends on where your league is. I know that in majority of leagues that we're in, that round 3 to round 4 is sort of where you see those quarterbacks start to go. And so, to be able to grab Hurts there, I think is a good spot. Devonta Smith is probably right in that range too, where you're talking about, rounds 4, round 5, even, depending on how your quarterbacks sort of shake out. That's probably where he's going in redraft. Dallas Goedert, talked about like injuries really hurt him. I think that sort of pushes him to a back end tight end 1. In some leagues, he might even go as a tight end 2, and that's fair. And I think that it just really comes down to the ball is not going to get around to him as much. I think that they're going to try to utilize the run more than they did. And then when the ball goes out, I think that it's going to A.J. Brown really more than anybody. Devonta will get his, but I'm not sure if Dallas Goedert sort of is on his down trek here. And listen, I'm a Dallas Goedert owner in Dynasty, and luckily I have Trey McBride. I think that Trey McBride ranks light years ahead of him right now. I'm going to be starting him way more than I'm starting Dallas Goedert if he continues at the pace that he finished the season at. We're sort of seeing that cliff a little bit on Dallas Goedert start to come, and he's sort of coming back down to earth from what he was. I also think that Will Shipley is an interesting, potential handcuff. Obviously, you talked Kenneth Gainwell and how he's sort of a handcuff, but I really look at Will Shipley as a guy who's similar to Saquon Barkley, and that if Saquon were to go down, because obviously Saquon has gone down in the last couple of years, and he was able to stay healthy last year. But it seems like injuries has sort of been the theme to his career thus far. Will Shipley is a potential guy that right in as that Saquon replacement. And so I'm keeping my eyes on him as my handcuff if I go out and I get Saquon.
Yeah, definitely fair, Brett. And I mean, they have some weapons behind AJ Brown and Devonta Smith, but nobody I'd really put too much on the fantasy radar. More in terms of dynasty rather than in terms of redraft. I think that you can kind of see the top of each position and say, all right, yeah, they're going to get a bulk of those touches. Um, Maybe even you look at the running back room and you say, all right, there's a couple guys there that you could maybe figure something out. But I think it kind of speaks for itself here in Philly of they have those top guys and they're just going to ride with those guys. Uh, Ultimately looking for a Super Bowl this year.
Yep. So now we jump over to our final team here in the NFC East previews, and it's the Washington Commanders. Zach, listen, was a pretty big overhaul as far as the staff goes, new ownership. They go out and they get a new quarterback in the draft. They go out and they get a new running back to run alongside Brian Robinson in Austin Eckler. And then they went out in the draft and they picked a couple of receivers, a tight end, a receiver, that they can have, kind of back up and add to the depth. Zach Ertz, they bring in as well to be their number 1/2 because we're not really sure how Ben Sinnott and Zach Ertz are going to end up shaking out together. But they go out and they draft Luke McCaffrey as well to go sit in with Dotson and McLaurin. Zach, how do you see the Washington Commanders shaking out? And do you see Jaden Daniels being a potential quarterback one, or is he more of a super flex option?
Yeah, he's a super flex option this year. I'd say a lot of teams and a lot of dynasty owners, they kind of look for that like second year jump. Obviously, a lot of teams in the NFL look for the second year jump. So I think we're going to see that with a couple of different guys. But right now, I'd put Daniels just ahead of Williams in terms of those rookies because I think Daniels offers a little bit more on the floor in the run game. I think that's going to be something to really look at is his speed and his breakout ability at quarterback. And I think this offense with Cliff Kingsbury, and how he was able to run Kyler in his rookie year, like it's very similar. And I think I see a lot of similarities looking at this offense now. And I think that's going to help the Commanders. I think they're going to be a real solid team. Now with Daniels at quarterback, it's just about bringing all their team together, offense plus defense, and figuring that out. But I do think this is going to be a real solid year for this offense. And I'd look out for these weapons next to Daniels because I think they're all like in a pretty solid spot to have solid years. The top three, top four is Eckler and Robinson and McLaurin and Dotson. I think all four of them you can say, all right, let me keep an eye on these guys. I think Eckler, you probably put him more focused in the passing game, and that may hurt his value a tiny bit because I think you would say Robinson would take the early downs. He's the running back and figure things out. I don't even know if that's the case, Brett, because Austin Eckler, I mean, we look at Austin Eckler 2-3 years ago, he had the most rushing touchdowns in that 2-year stretch of anybody. He had 38 rushing touchdowns in 2 years. So, like, looking at that, it's like, all right, well, you got to kind of figure things out. I would say Robinson is the pure running back, in my opinion, looking at it right now, and Eckler is the passing down back, and they're going to figure things out. Could that leak into each other? Of course it can. I mean, they're going to figure things out. But this is pure by committee in this backfield. And some people may say, oh, well, that'll hurt Jaden Daniels' rushing value. Jaden Daniels will make his own rushing value. He's not worried about that. He can break out at any point. Like I said, the speed is something that really stands out from Jaden Daniels and his breakout ability, big play ability that he has with his feet. I would say McLaurin and Dotson. McLaurin's clearly the top guy. I would probably put him. I think people are kind of down on him right now. They're putting him 30s into 40s. I'd say I'd put him in that high 30s range. That would be more of a flex kind of player. Yeah, that's fair. There's a lot of weapons in that offense. I think that's the spot for him. And then I'd put a guy like Dotson, who people are also kind of a little bit down on. I'd put him also in a lower flex category. I'm kind of confused why people are so down on this Washington receiver room. I think they'll figure it out. And Daniels has proven in college that he's a good passer, so they can figure it out. The thing I'm curious about is that where to rank these running backs. It's kind of similar to that committee that we talked about in Dallas. I would say, all right, you probably put Robinson as the higher one because of the running game and maybe his rushing touchdowns, and then you put Eckler a little bit lower, probably that 25 to 35 range. You've kind of fit him in there.
Yeah, I think that it's sort of interesting as far as the running backs go. Just this team overall, I think, is a very, if I could say, bargain bin shopping. I think that you can get a lot of good value on picking some Washington Commanders because I think a lot of people are very low on them. Brian Robinson, now to me, he is the running back one. He's not going in drafts until almost round 8. I think that that's crazy as the running back one to be going, the back end of the 7th round, early 8th round. So for me, that's pretty good. And you got Terry McLaurin who's going after that. And I'm not sure quite why. As a wide receiver one, he's going to be the one, and he will get his. And so, yeah, I think to be able to get a guy like McLaurin later in the round to be able to get a wide receiver one, I think that that's a really, really good value. Eckler's probably going right around where McLaurin's going as well. And so I think that's a little bit of an overvalue just because he's the 2. But I can also see a lot of people taking him because of the name. I probably won't be one of those guys. I think that there's probably more value that can be had in that 9, 10, 11 round range. And then, yeah, Jaden Daniels, he's probably a super flex option for me right now. Until proven otherwise, he can use his legs. I think he's going to have to use his legs to be successful, much like we said with CJ Stroud last year, who had to sort of learn to use his legs, and he did to an extent. But I think that Daniels, the knock on him right now is the line is not that great. He's sort of going to be running for his life. Not an elite wide receiver core, which I don't totally disagree with, but I also don't think that they're slouches. Much like last year in Houston, where it was kind of like, okay, well, they looked at these guys and they were like, okay, well, they're not that good. I don't see it that way. We've seen Terry McLaurin be one of the top receivers in the league at times. And so, and even Dotson, I've seen Dotson go in the last couple rounds of drafts from all the mock drafts I've seen. It's just kind of crazy to me that he is also a guy who's had a bunch of hit weeks rather than whiff weeks. And so I think that, again, everybody's very low on Washington, and I'm not really sure why. But, as far as the dynasty standpoint, listen, the cliff hit, Austin Eckler, plain and simple. If you got out while you can, then good job. And otherwise, you're kind of just sticking with them and crossing your fingers and toes, hoping that he ends up being something so that you can cash in on him. Jaden Daniels, we talked about it from the ref recap episode, and he's going to end up going at the top of rookie drafts, but I'd be a little patient on him. He's the super flex option point blank right now. Obviously, if you are one of those teams who picked him in Dynasty, you might not have that quarterback option. So he is sort of your quarterback one. Temper the expectations, though. Maybe go out, trade for, one of those guys right in the middle of the pack, like a Jared Goff or something like that. He's going to get those points like Kirk Cousins. So at least you can establish yourself. And when Jaden Daniels does have a couple of those hit weeks, because that'll happen, at least you can be rewarded for that and not sit at the bottom of your standings. And then, yeah, listen, the value is super low right now on McLaurin and Dotson, even from Dynasty. And so I think those are two guys that buy low candidates. Even Brian Robinson's a buy low candidate right now that I think could end up being a high, high end running back too, if all goes to plan. I think the biggest hit from the dynasty standpoint really comes down to Chris Rodriguez, because I think that heading into the end of this season, we were like very high on him, and he was one of those like go out and try to acquire him for nothing. And most of the leagues that people were in, he was just sort of sitting out there on waivers. I think I'm staying away from him as far as the end of my bench role now. And then as far as the tight ends go, listen, I think that it's sort of interesting. There's a 2 tight end room. Got to figure that both guys will have some sort of impact, Zach Ertz and Ben Sinnott. I just think, like, from the standpoint right now, I can't be comfortable in redraft with either one of these guys because we're unsure. I think that both of these guys will be out on waivers in a lot of leagues. I could see a lot of people taking Ben Sinnott just as a last round flyer sort of a thing, like we just were talking about the Giants. But as far as the rookie drafts go in Dynasty, I think Ben Sinnott's probably like a 3rd round pick in rookie drafts. And I think it really just comes down to a lot of the people are looking at the potential that he only has to go against Zach Ertz. And we've seen Zach Ertz not be as productive in the last couple of years. We've seen, obviously, the injury from last year that sort of derailed what he had going in Arizona, requested his release as well. So I see it from the rookie side. I don't see it from the redraft side.
Yeah, definitely fair. I think just 2 things that I to finish off this for Washington. I think you did mention Chris Rodriguez. I think when you look at maybe a year or 2 down the road, like, yeah, I mean, they like him. Like, they do. So it's just a guy to keep an eye on. Because obviously Eckler's not going to play forever. He's getting up there in age, and although they gave him contract, like, it's not going to be a long stay, I believe, for Austin Eckler in Washington. I do think the career's coming towards an end, and he's going to be out of there pretty soon. Even though he, like I said, signed this deal with them. I look at Dotson, though, and I put a nice check mark next to him, Brett, because he's added to the sleeper list, like right near the top of it. He is ranked way too low right now. A guy who, yes, it's been a little bit off, and that I think has to do with what they had in Washington the last couple of years. Like, I mean, you cannot judge him from that standpoint of, oh, well, they had this offense and he didn't look good. They got a brand new offense. They got a lot to look forward to. They also have Cliff Kingsbury calling plays. I mean, we talk about some of the smaller wide receivers that have become like names because they were in a Cliff Kingsbury offense. I mean, you even talk, okay, well, they had Hopkins and Hollywood Brown. Well, Hollywood Brown was the number 2, and then he became really good. They also had other guys like Rondell Moore, who, I mean, became a name because of what he was able to do in a Kingsbury offense. Just those short, fast guys. And I think Dotson could be even on a higher level than a guy like a Rondell Moore, even in that offense. He's the number 2 right now, and I think they're going to want to throw the ball. Even though, yes, they have the running backs and yeah, it's just McLaurin. Like, Dotson is a guy to keep an eye on, and I'll draft him if nobody wants him. I'll put him on my bench for a little bit. And if all of a sudden he starts to boom, then yeah, great. You picked him in the 14th round. Like, he has a check mark next to him in my mind, Brett. He's definitely added to the sleeper list. We got one on the sleeper list.
Yeah, certainly. I think that, there's it's just crazy to me how, like, some of these guys have been successful and now all of a sudden, like, people are just forgetting about them. And listen, we're in May right now, so the rookie draft will do that to you. The dynasty community is starting to take over a little bit, and dynasty is becoming a more popular thing. And so I think that a lot of people are sort of meshing the two, dynasty and redraft a little bit right now. And we'll see what happens as far as, the next couple months. But yeah, I would gladly take Dotson in the 15th round if he was offered up there for McLaurin in the 10th round. I'm baffled still by all of these haters. I think that Dan Quinn, respectful coach, and they'll be able to right the ship a little bit. Zach, I think we got to get right to it as we literally preview our AFC East next week. Zach, I think that as far as the entire division goes, it's sort of the big storyline. Aaron Rodgers is coming back. The Buffalo Bills losing out, having to make a bunch of cuts as far as the salaries go and traded away Stephon Diggs. And Miami just seems to be getting faster. New England, obviously, they pick a rookie quarterback. I think that, it's probably not going to affect them this year. But from the longer term standpoint, I think that that's sort of where they're at this year. They're kind of looking at the long term, but those big three teams, I think, are going to have a real impact from fantasy. Obviously, we talk at the top of the draft. Tyreek Hill is probably going to be there. Breece Hall is probably going to be there. Garrett Wilson's probably going to be there. Josh Allen's probably going to be there. I think that those are the big four players. And just quickly touching on it, what's your outlook here, the AFC East in general, from the fantasy standpoint?
It's going to be a division to really watch for, Brett. One of the divisions that we really say, all right, yeah, there's some real names there to keep an eye on, and I think they're going to just battle each other. A lot of names, obviously, in the running back rooms. Of course, Miami's got a packed running back room. Then you also have Breece Hall, who's going to be at the top of drafts. You also got James Cook, a guy to keep an eye on with how much was lost in Buffalo. And then, of course, Ramondre Stevenson for New England. And you could say, oh, well, it's a project year. Yeah, that would help Ramondre Stevenson. That means he's getting more touches. So as long as he's healthy. So the running backs is what really stands out to me in that stretch there. And I think they're really all 4 or 5 of them going to have a real impact in fantasy this season. Definitely something to watch out for in this division.
Yeah, remind me next week. We got to talk some James Cook here. As a James Cook owner, I have a lot to say on the matter of dynasty and redraft standpoint. I think that a lot of people are writing him off just based on the cuts, but I also think that this might be a time to potentially cash in on him from the dynasty standpoint. But we'll break that down next week. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Give us a thumbs up. And in the perseverance of the night is darkest before the dawn, we shall rise yet again. For Zach Malvin, I'm Brett Malvin. This has been the Third Round Reversal Fantasy Football Podcast. We will catch you on the next one.